Ago, I got the privilege to meet the Dalai Lama, who actually had attended one of the ceremonies here, I think 10 years ago or something like that. But he called on 50 people who are in the humanitarian sector, and we had a private meeting with him. And what I came out of the meeting, in which he said, if you cannot respect the people you are serving, then better not serve them. And as a result, I came back to my organization and had some serious conversations and a lot of reflections that if we cannot respect the people we are serving in every aspect of our work, then we better not serve them, actually, because we're not doing the job. And yet, the conversation of today is, are we respecting the people we are serving? It's been almost a year since the Me Too movement called out some very powerful men. When it started in Hollywood, I think everybody who actually even met Harvey Weinstein like a mile away knew what happened. And everyone's like, it's Hollywood. Then in journalism, then in politics, then in art, and it just women kept on naming in men in every single sector. And at the beginning, it was like, of course, and then you're surprised and surprised and surprised. And I feel like it got to a stage where our heroes have failed us. Even the heroes sometimes fell to this. But then the humanitarian sector got called. And that was the shock. Because it's a sector where we actually go about it with self-righteous values. We are the good people. We are the ones who serve the poorest of the poor and the most marginalized. We go to conflict areas and humanitarian disasters and famines, and we show up when no one shows up before. And yet, the report that came actually from the House of Commons International Development Committee names some horrible things about our own sector. In a conversation today, where we are reassessing and resetting the need of our moral compass, this is a conversation that I hope we have the safe place to actually have these conversations. Here are some of the things that this report says. In July of this year, one MP calls it complacency verging on complicity, calling our sector of some of the things that has happened. Named organizations such as UN, different aspects of the UN, Oxfam, Save the Children, and a few others. The countries that the scandals came from Haiti to Syria to Liberia to Sierra Leone. The accusations varies from paid sex, food for sex, it goes on, exchange, all kinds of exchanges. The problems it created, abortions, STDs, loss of education, abuse, reduced employment opportunities, social exclusions, the very issues that we are all set to actually address. We are here in existence to create social inclusion, and yet the report talks about our own complicity and complacency in social exclusion of women who are the most marginalized. One recipient of aid talks about an aid, she said, quote, an aid worker made me pregnant, but now he left me and is loving another woman. The confusion, the hurt that our sector have caused is inexcusable, in my opinion. Another MP says, an abject failure in tackling sexual abuse. Now we are here to discuss resetting our own moral compass, and I have the honor, and the privilege of being in the company of great panelists with us. I want to start with, well, Ted, you are in my right here. Ted Bunch, who's the co-founder of A Call to Men, dedicated to end all forms of violence and discriminations against women and girls. He actually is a pioneer that led the biggest program in America to end domestic violence and to deal with domestic violence offenders. I also have Carrie Hessler-Radelet, who is the President and CEO of Project Concern International, global development organization working with families and communities to enhance health and hunger and overcome hardship in 18 countries. Previously, she comes with an extensive experience at the Peace Corps, which she's going to talk with us more about it. And finally, Katja Iversen, who is the President and CEO of Women Deliver, leading global advocate for investments in gender equality and the health, rights, and well-being of girls and women. She focuses on maternal and reproductive health and has more than 25 years of experience in NGOs, corporate, and the UN sector. So welcome to this discussion. I promise you honest, conversational, and to the point conversation. And I want to start with you, Carrie. Were you surprised by the report?
You know, I was not surprised at all because this has been my reality for more than 30 years. In 1981, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Samoa with my husband, Steve, and I was sexually assaulted by the person who supervised me, who was the Associate Peace Corps Director, highest ranking Samoan. He assaulted me 3 times in the Peace Corps office. He stalked me when my husband was not with me and where I was in a place where he could slip in unnoticed. So he was clearly watching my every move. And it affected every bit of my Peace Corps service. I did not tell anyone except my husband. I swore him to silence, and I have to say that the effects of my assault may have been even worse for him. His hopelessness, his anger, his rage was horrific. The reasons I didn't disclose were the same reasons you hear and that you can read about in the report. I feared that no one would believe me. He was the highest ranking Samoan and head of the Lutheran Church in Samoa. I was afraid that I'd be forced to leave my village where I was working, and I loved being a Peace Corps volunteer. And besides that, there were absolutely no services for reporting sexual assault at the Peace Corps. And so there were no incentives to do so. And I did not report until it happened the 3rd time. And then I did go and I spoke to the highest ranking female Peace Corps volunteer who filed a report with Washington, and nothing happened to that man. He continued to serve 15 more years, and he assaulted many women, both Peace Corps volunteers and the community members that we served, I later learned. So 30 years later, I was appointed the Deputy Director of the Peace Corps, and 2 weeks after I arrived, I was called by the television program 2020 that told me that they were going to do a media expose on the Peace Corps and the lack of care and support that some volunteers reported, especially around the issue of sexual assault. And immediately I was confronted by 6 extraordinary women who came forward with their stories, their very painful, real stories of how Peace Corps had failed them as volunteers. And so I heard their stories, and their stories were my stories. And I knew that our agency had failed them, and in failing them, we had hampered their recovery, and we had made it difficult for them to perform the services that they had so desperately wanted to serve. So this began a very long, I would say, process of rebuilding the Peace Corps. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the solutions, but I will say this, that we had to rip our agency down to the core in terms of our values to rebuild it with a volunteer-centered, trauma-informed approach. The Peace Corps went through more than 30 policy changes. We created an Office of Victim Advocacy. Every single volunteer and staff person is trained. We have specialized training in trauma-informed care for first responders. There is an external hotline hosted by RAIN, what is it? It's
sexual assault.
It's a national sexual assault hotline, which is top of class, so that volunteers could call in anonymously and get care and support from someone other than Peace Corps. And we are guided, Peace Corps is guided by a sexual assault advisory council of our nation's leading experts. We were lucky in that we had the whole weight of the US government behind us in terms of our response, and I was held accountable by the president and the vice president, and I did not want to fail them. And I did not want to fail our volunteers because their experiences were exactly my experiences.
So here's a question that I want to throw to Katja. Because as you were saying, Carrie, it's a long story. We've all known these stories. I mean, my first encounter of it, not personally, but I was working in Bosnia and Sarajevo during the war, and it was a very public story that the UN, some, not all, some of the UN missions, some individuals at UN missions and the peace troops would literally exchange food for for sex. And so this was 25 years ago, basically, where women would go and say, okay, I'll just do that, just give us food. 25 years later, you hear it later in Congo, DR Congo, you then hear it most recently in Syria. It's exactly the same story. And we've been like screaming and talking and no one hears about it. So Katja, why haven't institutions responded so fast, whether they are NGOs or whether it's the UN, frankly?
I think we all have our stories, and Carrie, hearing you just kind of, don't know about you, but it makes me tear up and it makes me remember my stories.
Yeah, we all have stories.
And that's many years ago too, and seeing not just a system, but systems that systematically, because systematic is a key word here, has failed to listen, has failed to act, has failed to put in systems, and has failed to do a systemic change.
Why?
And we can kind of look at the surface, and then it's kind of, okay, it's difficult because it has reputational risk. If you go and admit this has happened, we've seen that over the last year, we've seen it before. It has more reputational risk in terms of donor dollars and krona, or whatever it is, than guarding the welfare of the survivors and the victims. But if we look further into it, it's also because the system are wrong. You know, if we look at the humanitarian sector, it's a little bit of a cowboy sector. And it's a lone guy, and we go out, we work hard, we party hard, and that has consequences. We see a lack of women in leadership. We see a lack of focus on the ones we are here to serve, because it becomes a job. It becomes something we are doing. It becomes a rush. Yeah. And we see that in the system. And that can both be men and women. So we see a toxic culture in the humanitarian section. And that sector. That's not saying that everybody is like that.
Of course not.
But it is work hard, party hard, get shit done, and get out of there.
So, Ted.
Yes.
Can you explain to us cowboys? No, but I mean serious, because, you know, it's interesting. I have to tell you a story. One time I took a group of people to DR Congo to show them Women for Humanitarian International's work. And we're spending the whole day with women survivors of wars who have like gone through horrible, massive rapes and killing and torture and all of that. And these were men in here from the States, actually. And at the end of the night, you know, we all go to the hotel, because those who are in the sector know you go to the exact same hotel, you meet the exact same people. It's a very incestuous community. And with a couple of drinks, one of the guys says, I understand why these men are raping. And my heart just like dropped. I was like, this is a friend who's saying that. And it's like one thing is like, this is war, all of these things, these other people are doing that. It's another thing that him saying, I understand these. He was saying, you have to understand the rush, all of that. No, I by no means, and I'm a big believer that we cannot blanket any community or gender or sex or any group of people as one thing at all. So this is by no means assuming a generalization. But can you explain that behavior that was taken for granted without an awareness about it?
Well, I want to say first, thank you for sharing your stories and all the stories that women, I think every woman has a story. And if that's true, then we have to look at men. And as we talk about the Me Too moment, this last year has been challenging for us as a nation, as a world, but also for me, it's a very exciting moment in time for men, because there isn't, and we're kind of figuring it out, and we talk about the cowboys or the men's club, but I don't think there's a man that exists that I've met who hasn't either done something or said something that was sexually objectifying a woman or discriminatory, or witnessed another man saying something or doing something and did nothing about it. He does not exist. He may do something about it now, but even myself, before I did this work, I heard a sexist joke at the water cooler, or the Keurig, I guess it would be now, and didn't say anything about it. So it's an interesting moment, and the system that we're talking about, that system is really the culture of manhood. how we're taught to be men, how we pass that teaching down to our boys, that the male domination, sexism, patriarchy, I mean, we really have to look at those things. Now, this is not an indictment on manhood. It's actually an invitation to men. I think that's really important, that men realize, because this gives us an opportunity as we're resetting our moral compass to where we can reflect, because every man has reflected in the last 6 to 12 months. Every man has looked in the rearview mirror and reflected, and it gives us an opportunity to reset, saying we don't do those things anymore. We have to move forward. So when we look at how women have been treated all around the world, and we look at the systems, whether it's the UN or whether it's the film industry or the humanitarian industry sector, it's all these sectors, wherever men are in leadership, this is what you see, because we've been taught as men, we're actually expected to objectify women. The workplace is really a microcosm of our greater society, and we're taught that we're supposed to objectify women. That's one of the ways we define ourselves as men, is to devalue women and see women and boys as being more valuable than men and girls, to see women as the property of men, and to see women as sexual objects. That's one of the ways we actually prove that we're men. So in this construct. All of this is making us challenge that construct, which is a very important thing and really an important moment. And it's an exciting time because we really do have to look at how we've impacted people. Male privilege has been exposed in ways that it's never been exposed before. And if you're not seeing it now, you certainly saw it a few weeks ago all over the television, white male privilege in particular, but male privilege. And male privilege, the beauty of this, and I want to say this to my men and those who identify as male in the audience, that as a black man and as men of color and white men, this is common ground that we have. Because we all have this privilege. It shows up, it's in the room. When I came in the room, it's waiting for me. Can you hear the hum? It's there all the time, right? And we pay attention to it. So we're paying attention to it now, and this is an important moment.
It is an important moment. It's the moment to show up for all of us. So, Carrie, at one point I want to talk about what can we do in a tangible way, but before we go there, I want to ask what has been the ripple effect of the Me Too movement globally? And is it been, there's always, however, cynicism, resentment, all of that between the communities that are being helped and between the international aid that comes, and there's always a tension. Of arrogance or corruption or whatever it is. Right. How has that impacted, as we are reflecting on ourselves as a community, what has been the impact overseas from the communities we are serving as well?
I think it is definitely affecting the humanitarian industry, so to speak. Use that term, and I think it is an industry. We are all looking in. Every CEO is quaking in their boots, I would say. We all fear that which we don't know, let's be honest. Some organizations have better systems in place than others, but most really don't. And so it's causing a lot of introspection into all of our organizations, which is very good. I know that when I was the director of the Peace Corps, I was deputy first and then became the director. I was so grateful that these women came forward because it gave me the mandate, and we got a law, by the way. A law was passed by Congress that forced us to have a trauma-informed, victim-centered approach. That helped us to do our work. NGOs don't have that, and so we're going to have to rely on leaders. So all around the world, I would say, leaders of nonprofits are looking inward, fearful that their funding will be taken away or that their reputation may be sullied. And that is a powerful influencer, I would just say, too. But I would also say that while the Me Too movement has benefited people like me, who I now suddenly feel empowered to speak, there are millions and millions of women who still are highly vulnerable and who still fear retaliation, whose food will still be taken away from them, or they can be denied shelter if they don't have sex, and rape, and other forms of dignity deterring measures. I mean, it's still a horrific situation for many. And I just think that, and in a moment we're going to talk about the culture, but I think it is absolutely critical that we talk about culture change and institutional commitment to trying to address the power imbalance, because sexual assault and exploitation takes place wherever there is gender inequality and power imbalance. and our industry is rife with both.
Katja, how do we do that?
No, I just want to,
Yeah.
if I may just pivot
Yeah.
on that, because this is not about sex, but I guess we all know that. It is about power.
Yeah.
And we really need to grapple that, both the individual's agency, but also the systemic power plays in play here. That's one of the things that we, with Women Deliver, we're an advocacy organization, and we work for gender equality at all levels, but particularly on health and rights of girls and women. And we are taking up the issue of power in the world's largest conference on gender equality coming up in 228 days, not that we're counting, because we really have to do that. So that's 6,000-7,000 people up the coast in Vancouver. But we really have to look at it. We really have to look at both the individuals, but also the systemic, what's holding the change back. And we often just saying, a lot of the voices we've heard in aid to are the employers, the female employers' voices, because there hasn't been space for the beneficiary or the girls and women we work for to speak out highly. That's one of the things I love with the report, that it goes beyond the people employed in the aid industry to actually also be the women, and the consequences there
Are much higher.
are so high.
Ted, I want to, we're now going into how do we go about the change,
Yeah.
in a constructive way. And as someone, I can only tell you my experience of working with women who survived rapes in conflict areas. I was, for the longest time, just helping them survive and rebuild their lives and, get their jobs back and confidence back and the psychosocial support and all of that. And then at one point, it's like, we just need to do prevention. And it's like not enough just to help women rebuild their lives. You are all about prevention. You're like the pioneer of prevention. Can you tell us, how did you do it and what did you learn from it?
Sure, thank you. So A Call to Men, we're a national organization but do quite a bit of international work also, and our mission is to create a world where all men and boys are loving and respectful and all women and girls are valued and safe. Our work is really around, and we do that through, thank you. And we do that through the promotion of healthy and respectful manhood, because that's really where the challenge is. And as we increase and promote a healthy, respectful manhood, we know that we'll decrease and prevent domestic violence, sexual assault, bullying, heterosexism, homophobia. It'll all go away. So prevention is the key, because right now we respond to everything through intervention, meaning something has to happen and then we want to do something about it. Well, our work is to go upstream to prevention where it never happens in the first place, which means addressing as men, and again, it's not an indictment on manhood. There's a lot of wonderful things about being a man, but there's some things that are problematic not only for women and girls and those who don't conform to gender at all, but for men. Yeah. So our liberation as men is directly tied to liberation of women. So when we look at prevention, we have to look at our own behaviors and really evaluating ourselves and what we're passing down to the next generation. Because what I'm passing down was just what I've been taught from the men of the generation above me. And I just want to share with you, if I could, we have a Live Respect curriculum. It's a high school curriculum that we wrote with Scholastic. It's available online. It's in the UK, it's in the US, and it's in Kenya, actually, doing very well. And it's coaching healthy, respectful manhood. It's for middle and high school boys. And I bring this up because we surveyed hundreds of boys, high school boys, and asked them a number of questions. And we asked them this question, and this was US boys, but I'm sure it's true anywhere else, because the problem is universal, and the solution is also. That bridge from intervention to prevention, that's us, that's men. Because while the overwhelming majority of violence against women and girls is men's violence, the overwhelming majority of men are not violent, but we're silent about the violence other men perpetrate, and that's as much of the problem as the violence is. If I say to that man, hey, knock it off, or you can't do this or that with me, he'll stop. He wants to be respected by men. So this high school curriculum, we asked high school boys all around the country from all different demographics, all different communities, do you know what consent is? Only 19% of our boys, mine and yours, knew what consent is. 8 out of 10 boys, yours and mine, did not know what consent was. Wow. So that explains a lot. It explains sexual assault in college campuses. It explains sexual assault in the military. It explains why girls and women between 16 and 24 are at the highest risk for being sexually assaulted, because our boys think no means try harder because we haven't told them anything different. Yeah. So we have to be able to, so they're taught to objectify girls, just like we were taught to objectify girls, and we wound up bringing that into the workplace or into wherever we are, because that's the way we are as men. That's how we, again, prove ourselves as men.
So how do you go about teaching consent? Beyond no means no.
Having conversations with our boys, especially men having conversations with our boys, right? Because if I asked, if this was a room full of fathers and I asked them, when should your daughters have sex, they would say, every time, wherever I go. And if I ask those same group of men, when should your sons have sex, they're like, well, you know, when's it offered? Or, you know, gee, he's going to college as a virgin and dad's scratching his head. So we can't have it both ways. So we have to start having conversations with our sons about respecting girls, boundaries, what that means, what no means. Just having basic respect for girls growing up. So we're not saying to that 6-year-old boy throwing that football or kicking that soccer ball, because it happened, I did the same thing in South Africa that I do here. I asked a group of fathers, 6-year-old boy learning how to kick a soccer ball, and you say to him, you have to kick hard on that sound. You kick like a... How do you all know that too? See, because now girls kick just fine, but this is our socialization. So our boys are getting these messages not to value girls all their life. They're getting messages that it's only about, your only interest in girls should be about sex, right? And then ultimately, women are your property. So they're getting these messages all the time. Even my own sons who live with me and get this every day, when they come back home after they're out there in the world, I got to give them a tune-up. I got to adjust this, I got to alter that, right? So it really comes to us having conversations, but we have to believe that women are equal to us. We have to believe that we have to connect with the humanity in women, because we don't, unless they're women in our lives. So I'll just wrap this up with saying the way that we touch the hearts of men, because that's what we have to do. Most men want to do the right thing, and we're doing the right thing in our world, in our family, and we feel like that's enough, but it's not. We have to take more responsibility, because if women could have ended men's violence against women, they would have. And the women in the congregation said, or amen is another way of saying it. And,
Did you have a private session with the audience before? Like, how did they know all of that?
So if women could have done it, they would have. It's up to us, because we're the ones perpetrating the violence and abuse.
Thank you. Wow.
Thank you.
Really. Katja, you also work on youth. You also address youth issue, and you say this is very important. Tell us more about that.
Yes, and then we're going to get to the solutions, because that's just so important.
Or we can just go to the solutions.
Okay, I think we can combine those. Is that okay? All right.
Please.
Good,
Yes.
because you know, kind of, we can.
Yeah.
Way too often we see that we stay in the problem.
Yeah.
Ted, I think you're putting some really good solutions, but let's continue in that vein. So I have 3.5, if that's okay. One, we need to invest in women's organization in humanitarian sessions. In humanitarian settings. So we, less than 0.2% of global aid goes to civil society in humanitarian settings, and only a fraction of that goes to women's organizations. But women are on the front line in most humanitarian settings and fragile settings. They're the ones fighting, they're the ones getting up in the morning, they're the ones kind of getting their children, you know, if there is a school under a tree, as we heard about, you know, they just fight. As we say in Women Deliver, a little polemically, women deliver and a lot more than babies. And we really, really need to invest in them, because there is a ripple effect when we do. So invest in women's organization is key. 2, we need that culture shift. And it can come in multiple ways. And I think, Ted, you pointed to some really, really good ones. It starts at home. But in humanitarian settings, 1, we need more women in leadership. You know, if we look at the humanitarian sector, there's so few women in leadership. Yes, I'd like that applause. And then it is, as I started out by saying, looking at the culture and what work culture we perpetuate, and what is acceptable and what is done, and when it's said no or yes, or encourage a culture where we listen to women, where we learn from the survivors, and where we take action accordingly. So it's a systemic change, both in who, but also in how. And then we also need to bridge that gap, or bridge between what we call humanitarian setting and development.
That's true.
Because, you know, I know I'm painting a really kind of with a broad brush here, but you have the humanitarian setting, it's one type of people, it's one type of agencies, it's one type of tools, but many of the humanitarian settings, they last for decades. We have children who've never seen anything in a refugee camp. So that education that's happening there, that socialization that's happening there, the development that's lagging, so we've got to bridge it into development, because that's another way of thinking. We're seeing some of it, but we're not seeing enough of it, and we're definitely not seeing it with women at the heart. And then the third and a half is we need to do it together. You know, I love what you say, Carrie, about that we have good guidelines, that the Peace Corps has developed something. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. So we have, how does an organization react and do and prevent, but also how do we work together so we don't pit each other against each other.
It's so true. No, it's very, very true in all of it. And I actually want to just talk about, for a few minutes, about money. Because really, the statistics that you're talking about, the fraction women get, it's like, I feel like every other year I check, has the statistic changed? It hasn't.
No.
It's been decades. We get like 10 cents of every dollar in development aid, basically, and it hasn't changed. So in an era where everyone is celebrating women, I personally talked with a lot of the women who, with courage, went and named their aggressors and led to major cultural shift, and they were dropped.
Right.
With no support, no jobs, emotional consequences, all of that. So we have to really, really have an intentionality behind money. But money here has a major role in here, because, you know, as NGOs, you know, sort of like perhaps more than any other sector, they cannot afford to reflect or be transparent so much about some of the issues that is happening all over, because it's so dependent on donors' aid. And if the donor doesn't like you, or if you say, well, we have the scandal in our group, or whatever it is, they can shift their money. So how do you navigate our reality, the NGO's reality, that it's a very dependent sector on someone else's money, basically, and it does need evolution and reforms, and how do you hold these two, and what's the donor's role in that? Carrie.
You know, they're very much related, and I think you asked earlier about why are the organizations silent, and I think it's because they fear the loss of their money and the loss of their reputation, which then means that the private individual donors are going to withdraw their support. So it's a vicious circle. You come forward, you risk, you know, losing cash. Oxfam has lost more than 16 million pounds as a result, and so at the very time when they're being asked to make dramatic reforms, they have less money to deal with. So that's one thing. I would like to offer a few more solutions, because I think it's really important to talk about solutions. And Ted, I think you offered probably some of the most important, is that we need to have culture change in our own homes. But for NGO leaders, foundation leaders, or donor leaders, I have a few things I'd like to offer from my own experience. Number one, even if you have not experienced a sexual assault scandal in your own organization, I urge you to take a look now and to seriously educate your staff, to develop good policies, and to act as though you do, because it is highly likely that you have survivors within your organization, and it is also likely that you have possibly people who have done things that they're not proud of. You could have perpetrators among you, and none of us like to talk about it, but it's absolutely, if you're a large organization, it's quite likely that you do. You've got to deal with it now, and you have to deal with it intentionally. Number two, as a leader, I feel like it's vitally important to lead with authenticity and vulnerability, because the most important ingredient is creating an environment in which people feel free to come forward to express their truths. And if you don't have an open environment where people can feel comfortable coming forward and have those deep conversations that are so needed, your effort will not be successful. And then third, I would say, and it piggybacks onto yours, you have to really mean it. This kind of work that it takes years. And it takes going down to the very root of who you are as an organization. What are your values? What are your, how does sexual assault or the systematic gender and power imbalances affect your ability to accomplish your mission? You've got to address differences in norms and practices related to gender and related to power. And you've got to create policies and programs that will support freedom for survivors to come forward and to have honest discussions around issues. Places where humanitarian workers can come forward and saying, this is what's happening, how can we deal with it? Young men to come forward and say, this was in my past, but that's not who I am now, so how can I come forward in the future and live positively? So creating that environment means you've got to dig deep and you've got to really draw on every resource that your organization has.
Yes, please.
And the money is critical. I was lucky when I led Peace Corps because Congress gave me a mandate. I had no question. I had to do it. And they, by the way, didn't give me any more money. The only way I could afford to do it was to take down the number of volunteers. But I was comfortable doing that because I didn't think that I could honestly put out another volunteer in a place where I didn't feel like I could look their parent in the eye and say, I'm going to keep your son or daughter safe. Or I'm going to create an environment where your son or daughter can be successful in another country and not be a perpetrator. And so the money is a big issue. I was told by Congress if I did not effectively address this question, we would get lower budgets in the following year. So the incentives were created for me. NGOs don't have that luxury. And so I ask all of you who are donors to support this. It costs money to have programs like this. And so please support this. When your NGOs put this in their line item, support it. If they don't have it in their budgets, ask them why they don't. This needs to be an organization. This needs to be something that every single organization takes on with funding.
Thank you. Ted.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please.
Your point, Carrie, and also what you had spoken to. And while they're putting that in the budget, check your budget line to make sure that women are paid the same as men while you're doing that. But I wanted to mention just a little bit, as you were saying, some women who are speaking out are having a hard time, right? Because there's a backlash that's happening, right? When you challenge, in this case, an oppression, male dominance, then sexism rears its ugly head. And that's what we're seeing. And so the backlash, so I just want to offer this, because I've been doing, over the last year, doing a lot of training, especially in corporate America, around sexual harassment in the workplace, the culture that allows that to exist. And good, well-meaning men have said things like, well, I'm not going to have a closed-door meeting with a woman because I don't want anything to be misinterpreted or so forth and so on. So I say, well, you know that the issue of a closed door, the problem, what happened behind that closed door was not what women were doing, it's what men were doing, right? And if you're going to have that policy, then that needs to be your policy with men too. Otherwise, it's discrimination, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Very good
I mean,
point.
right? So, but men are really feeling protective because we don't know how to navigate this, because we're the first generation of men being held accountable for something men have always gotten away with, and we don't know how to navigate it. So it's important, and we have to figure that out, right? We have to figure that out. So and also, calling men out is really important because it holds men accountable. It allows victims to have a voice and also healing, hopefully, but we also have to be intentional about calling men in because that's where the solution lies.
Yeah, so important.
I like it. Yesterday you were saying it's also about love. I mean,
That's the
ultimately
only
we
way.
have to engage in a
Yes,
loving
it
way
has
as
to.
well. Talking about love, Katja, I'm all about love these days. We need more love in the world.
We do.
The only sector we did not talk about is the constituents themselves that we are serving. And the report, the British government report, asked that women who are the beneficiaries or constituents, or however you refer to them in their own organizations, need to be part of the solutions. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely, and that's where a lot of the women's organizations also come in on the solution side. And when the organization take a serious look at themselves, it's not just about employees, it is really about who do we work with, what communities are we in, and what are the dynamics and interactions there. So I believe that a lot of change starts with youth. Today, just two numbers. Half the world's population is under the age of 30. In humanitarian and fragile settings, we have 1.4 billion people living. Half of them are under 20. So what Ted says, it's not just in a context here, it is globally, that it starts at home, and it really starts on the gender norms and what we do. But if you look at that, half the world's population is under 30, that's also 7 billion opportunities and solutions. I see a tremendous change in the spirit and the action of young people, including when it comes to the voices. So investing in them and seeing them not just as leaders of tomorrow, as you know, is often torchbearers and all that. It's nice and beautiful, but they are really leading today. And sometimes we need to step aside and let them do that, even when it means handing over power.
So, thank you. I mean, there are some hard steps we all need to make, basically. Yeah. You know, money-wise, constituents-wise, reform-wise. And I want to end our last few minutes maybe with a minute for each of you about restorative justice. Because a lot of, in this moment, in order for it to be transformative moment, how do we transform it? Some say restorative justice, some say, you mentioned a lot of actions in here, but what is now the one thing that you can leave us all in, whether it's love or justice or whatever it is? How do we go about this moment to have it lead to lasting change? Ted.
Well, thank you. It's, and I want to thank the Hilton Foundation for the opportunity to really to share this conversation and to provide a platform for this. So I really appreciate that. That's really radical leadership. It really is. So I want to acknowledge them. That's really important. So, you know, when we talked last night, we were talking about love, that there has to be lenses of love that we see these things through, right? Wouldn't that be nice? You know, when you turn on the news, you're not hearing that, you know. People are dug in. So we have to go at this. There has to be accountability, but there has to be love, and there has to be some sort of road to redemption for those who take responsibility for their behavior. So that's a really important thing. And what I would want to say in just my closing is that as we challenge ourselves as a society, no matter what society you're from, and as we challenge, I'll speak to the men in the room, as we challenge ourselves as men, that we need to really accept that we need to do some things differently, and that's not a bad thing. And that as we move toward this, being intentional, right, using your influence and platform in a positive way. You have influence and platform in your life, in your work, in your family, in your community, to use it in a positive way. How can you move this message forward? And that this is not about rescuing or saving women. Women are totally capable of taking care of themselves. And the women in the congregation said,
amen.
Thank you. But this is about men, and you know, when we're not, and again, it's the minority of men who do these things, but it's a lot of things that they do. When men are not violent and abusive, safety takes care of itself. So it's really not about women, it's really about men. It's really about saving us, and everyone else benefits from that.
Carrie.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I actually think I'm going to speak on a personal level because for me, you know, for 30 years I was silent, and that silence within my body really ate at me. And when I had to come forward publicly, it meant that I had to finally face my sexual assault. And in doing so, let me step back and say that I really, you know, often look to Nelson Mandela, who's a great leader, and his Truth and Reconciliation movement that became the basis of the New South Africa, where perpetrators and victims were able to come together and speak their truth, I think is enormously important. So for me, as a person, as a survivor, but also as a person of faith, I felt that I had to forgive my perpetrator. And because I had never fully acknowledged my sexual assault, I had never even considered the need to forgive him. Now, I wish I could look him in the eye, tell him the pain that he caused me, not only during my Peace Corps service, but it eroded my confidence for years and made me fearful of being with men. And I could never tell him because he passed away 15 years ago. So I am instead living out my forgiveness by talking to others and urging honest dialogue. That is for me, lay your soul bare and talk about it, because that is the only way forward, especially with your children. Talk to your children.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Katja, last word.
Yes. So I'll end with a commitment and a tweet. Is that okay?
Okay.
So Women Deliver has a humanitarian program, advocacy program. We've actually been asked to start it to use some of our other strengths in advocacy and connections and convening to be in this space. So I commit to taking this forward in that program, and really the investment in women's voices, but also working with agencies and organizations together so we can take that. That was and then we'll continue that conversation in Vancouver at the Women Deliver conference. So be there, be square. And the tweet has just been modified because it's love, it's listen, it's learn, take action, invest in women, hashtag Hilton Price, hashtag Me Too, hashtag We Do.
Wonderful.
Bravo.
On that
Great way
note,
to
all we need is love. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.